Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another episode of eDiscovery After Hours. My guest this week is Andreas Mueller from Downstream. This was a great conversation. We talked about his childhood in Germany and how he has 2 degrees, including one in the culinary arts, both by the time he was 20 years old before he immigrated to the United States. And we talked about parenthood. We talked about, what the culture shock was of moving across the globe and some of the differences between the States and Europe. Germany specifically and Europe at large. And then we talked about Downstream, the venture that he's led over the last couple of years, and how and why they choose to stay narrow in an era where it's common for people to say they can do everything and we're a one-stop shop. So it's a really great conversation. I know that you are going to love it as well. Our sponsor this week is Discovery Master. When you are dealing with document review projects in Relativity, whether you've got a massive project and you just need automated QC stats and project metrics, or you're tracking multiple projects hosted within the same large instance or across multiple instances, no matter where the data lives, you can log in to www.discoverymaster.co and see it all. Thanks for tuning in.
Quick time!
You don't know how to drink, your whole generation.
Drinks on the house.
Yes, sir.
No, wait a second. Drinks are 50% off.
Right.
No, wait a second. Double the price of everything.
And I work only 16 hours a day.
A union man only works 8 hours a day.
I belong to 2 unions.
And now, eDiscovery After Hours with your host, Ryan Short.
All right, Andreas, welcome to eDiscovery After Hours. Cheers.
Cheers. Nice to meet you, Ryan.
Yeah, likewise. What are we working on here?
It's a cupcake Sauvignon Blanc.
Indeed, it is. I didn't get the cupcake. That wasn't part of the memo, but it is a Sauvignon Blanc over on this end. Well played. Now, I noticed you have some accoutrements in that glass there. What's going on?
I do. So living in Phoenix, Arizona, it's about high temp in August, 118. You are well suited putting some ice cubes in there. I'm normally not a fan, but unfortunately, I forgot to take the permanent ice cubes, the ones that don't really melt but still cool. I forgot to put them into the freezer last night. Shame on me.
No, it's cool. You and my grandmother, you're in good company. She's a wonderful woman, and she's actually Canadian. And she talks about how Canadians are so stingy with their ice, which is ironic since so much of their territory is covered in it. But, when she's now in Indianapolis, she's like, yeah, we give good ice here. Right. So there you go. Yeah. Phoenix. I was actually supposed to be out there in 2 weeks. My travel plans changed, but people who are like, oh, it's a dry heat. I'm like, yeah, well, it's 118 is 118. Like, no, thank you. I'll take a hard pass.
It's still hot. I mean, you will see the temperature when it hits about July, August in the teens, 110, 115, 118, 120. When you step into the car, you're well behooved to have one of those sunshades up. You will literally burn yourself, even if the sun doesn't shine into the car. So I've had moments where my old car had leather seats. I would sit down and, I would jump right back up out of the seats. Or I put the seatbelt on and I grabbed the buckle, and the buckle was metal, and it's just happened to be ambient temperature plus another 30, 40 degrees on top. A little bit painful. You learn your lessons. You try to find a covered parking spot, which are few and far between.
Yeah, cacti don't cast a big shadow. So, all right, Andreas, I may be stating the obvious here, but this is not an American Southwest accent. That or you're preparing for like a community theater, like a Von Trapp family production, and you're doing great. So where are you from originally?
Great question. Born and raised in Nuremberg, Germany. I call it the Alabama of Germany just because it happens to be in the South, and Alabama is a southern state.
Yeah.
But there I grew up essentially until 1998, and I came over to the States when I was 20. Yes, it's German first and last name.
So you came over for school, a love interest, or a job? Or just because you got a wild hair and wanted to prove to mom and dad you could get away? What's the deal?
All of the above and then not. So when I was 16, my stepfather is an American GI. And when I was 16, him and my mom moved to the States, but I had just started college.
Yeah.
So my folks were of the opinion I need to finish college in Germany. I said, fine. So they ended up buying a small apartment. at 16, which was kind of nice, living all by yourself. My grandma was about 20 kilometers or 14.6 miles down the road, but living by yourself at age 16. And I went to two different colleges. One was for culinary school, essentially becoming a chef, right? Wandering from chef to digital forensics, long story, but quite interesting.
That's part of why that's why we're here. It's an interesting story and we've got booze. So now you can tell me what this would pair well with, but continue.
Absolutely. And I finished my college degree there at age 18 and then switched over to how is it working in a factory? So I went for printing, multimedia, and desktop publishing. Essentially, newspaper, flyers, magazines, printouts, etc. I did that for 2 years until I was 20, also graduated from that school. And then I said, well, I've been here for 20 years. I've seen most of Europe already. We tend to travel really well in Europe. Everything is very convenient, short flights, short train rides on a high-speed train. And my folks had lived in the States, actually in Texas, and then they moved to Virginia. And I said, well, let me try this out. And I came here at age 20 for about 3 months. Decided then to go back to Germany, pursuing a job, only to come back about 4 weeks later after having shipped some of my belongings with United Airlines cargo, standing in front of the immigration officer, I believe at Dulles or at O'Hare. And he looked me in the eyes and he asked me, he said, so you're here again? I'm like, yes, I'm on school vacation. And he's like, okay, well, what are you doing? I explained it to him. And it was sort of like going down the road of, well, are you here to visit or are you here to stay? And fortunately, I was smiling enough. He let me into the country, and I believe that was the end of it.
Oh, man. Was this a harrowing moment, or you're just a cool operator and you're like, I got this, totally got it? How was the heart rate?
You know, it was probably bumping around 112 beats an hour, to be honest. I think I played it cool, but on the inside, you know how it goes. The facade itself doesn't tell you much. It was a firestorm inside, a firestorm of fear and excitement at the same time, right? Huge chapter into your life. You give up all of your friends and only to spend time in a foreign country, possibly for the rest of your life. And looking at this 24 years later, we're still here. Something must have gone right.
So knowing all of that, you know, a lot of times on this podcast, it'll be folks who either went to law school, right? Or they had thought that was their path. And then, you know, they were a paralegal for a while, or they joined support for a while. And then e-discovery became the thing. You have two very different degrees and then eventually got here. But so let's take our time. So culinary school, you start this when you're 16, 17 years old?
I originally started 14 before I went to school. I was working part-time after hours. We had a small restaurant maybe 2 miles down the road. I would ride my bicycle there and work on the weekends, just waiting tables, making some extra pocket money as a kid. And the owner, who was also the chef, his name was Yogi, not to be confused with Yogi Bear, but his name was Yogi. He had trained up in Norway at a very prestigious restaurant, and he wanted to open up his own, call it a countryside kitchen, or a local food type kitchen. And so I was helping him out, and I worked there in the front of the house at first, some serving, running the bar, pouring beers mostly because it's Germany, right? That part's easy, no fancy cocktails there needed. Until he said, come help me out in the kitchen. And that was it. I did this for about a year, working with him in the kitchen, learned a lot of things from him. And then he got me a job opportunity and a college opportunity. And that's when I started at 16.
Now, is it common to leave, you know, whatever the terminology is, you know, secondary school or high school or whatever, is it common to graduate at 16 in Germany, or were you on the fast track?
I was a little bit on the fast track. Same with my college degrees. I finished each one of them 1 or 2 years early. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're obviously a very lazy person. So there's a plug. And now the other thing I have to ask, I see there's a picture frame over your left shoulder, and I don't know if that's a son or daughter, but I wonder, would you, knowing what you know now, would you leave your child in Phoenix at age 16 and move back to Germany and just get them an apartment and say, hey, figure it out?
Good question. Good question. So a little bit more about my background. Together with my ex, I'm engaged now, but my ex and I, we have a 7-year-old daughter named Allison, and I lived in Boston back then with my ex and my daughter. Sometimes relationships just don't work out, but you want to do what's right for the kids. We
Yep.
did the whole co-parenting thing, not to get into too much personal detail, but nothing that we don't see every day with other families doesn't mean it's a bad thing.
Yep.
But we decided to split up, and I had the opportunity to move back to Germany working for Deloitte, building out the forensic practice in Germany. And I was on the fence. Allison back then was 3 or 4 years old, but love does overcome anything and everything. And I'm still here. Going down the years, now she's 7. She doesn't want to fly on her own yet, which makes sense. She's still in Boston. I'm in Phoenix. And I thought to myself, I have to build myself a good career. Mm-hmm. And that will allow my daughter to have a good upbringing, colleges, right? You get to get her into the nicer colleges and the more prestigious colleges, and just seeing her 4 times a year. But to answer your question, here in the States, just because of how spread out it is, unless it's a city like Boston where things are more dense, more populated, you look at Phoenix and it's roads, and more roads, most of them even without a sidewalk. So no, I would not feel comfortable, her at age 16 being on her own out here.
Yeah. So you hit on something. I tell guests right before we start recording, as I told you as well, like, hey, I want people to learn something about you they wouldn't know by looking at your LinkedIn, right, or by looking at your online profiles. And so one thing that people often don't know about me is that I'm a huge municipal finance nerd, which is random. But that's got me. Yeah, it's got me really into like the built environment and how America funds infrastructure and how, in my opinion, bass-ackwards it is. And so, to your point about Phoenix being roads, and more roads, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a post-World War II city. It's a post-air conditioning city, largely. And was it a culture shock for you to move to the States where you are a prisoner in your own vehicle, right? There's no transit. There's very little walking. It's a big shift. There's a handful of U.S. cities, right, that you can live in without a car. I was lucky enough to do that for 6 years, but that's a huge just lifestyle choice in terms of how you interact with your neighbors and with local businesses, and the size of pants you have to buy as your waistline expands from sitting in a vehicle. Was that a mind shift for you, or what were the culture shifts moving from Germany to the States as a young guy?
That's a good point. A couple of different things I noticed coming from Germany or Europe, for that matter, over to the States. So yes, you're correct. Number one, unless you live in one of the typical northeastern cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, even Pittsburgh to some extent, or DC, everything is driving. But it doesn't have to be driving. So I still see, and this is now 24 years in, folks have a grocery store literally 3 blocks down the road. They can walk to it, maybe not in Phoenix 120, but in most cities, folks can walk to it. They can take the bicycle to it. Forget about public transportation. You're correct. It's abysmal what we have over here, starting with the train infrastructure all the way down to the neighborhood infrastructure. But folks still like driving the car, even if it's only for 2 blocks and a carton of milk. And that's just what the culture is. And I had a very hard time in the beginning to just flat out accept that. Just because the way it works in Germany is you go to school and you go to work, and on your way home, whether you take public transportation or you walk or take your bicycle, you stop by the grocery store, which doesn't carry 10 different rotini pastas. It carries 2 brands of rotini pasta, just as an example. So they're smaller, but you buy 1 to 2 bags worth of groceries that will set you up for dinner and breakfast and lunch the next day. So you buy on an as-need basis. And suddenly my folks took me to my first Costco ever.
I was going to say Costco, yeah.
And, 20 years old, I've seen a lot, but going into this huge warehouse saying, so that's where people buy the groceries and things, and walking home with 20 rolls of toilet paper versus your 6-pack or your 2-pack of toilet tissue. Buying 5 gallons of tomato sauce versus a 500 milliliter jar. It was interesting. Now, fortunately, that mindset has shifted over the years just because you get used to it. Yeah. Just like you, I've had ample of years. I lived in Boston off and on for about 16 years throughout my last 24 years.
It's a great
city. Somewhere else and always moved back. It's an absolutely fantastic city. And that was big city, small city type living. You can walk everywhere. Public transportation was great. I lived in DC. Then I moved to Houston. That was a whole different ballgame. You drive everywhere. Poor Ari. He lives out in the woodlands, I believe, which is a very gorgeous area.
Yeah.
I've done Denver, Colorado, was also different. So I've been fortunate enough to get different type of living feeling in different cities.
Yeah. No, that's good. So tell me a little bit more about life outside the office. You said you're engaged. Congratulations. That's fantastic. Now, I also have our daughter. My oldest daughter is about the same age as I think you said, Allison, right? So my oldest daughter is Rosie. So how are you finding parenting a 7-year-old girl? Because we could maybe compare notes off camera. I have some successes and a long list of challenges.
It's quite interesting. One thing my ex does really well is Allison's being kept very busy. So she got Monday through Friday school. She got swimming classes, horse riding, ice skating, Russian math, Mandarin Chinese, Girl Scouts. So she is busy 6 days out of the week from morning to night, which is
no
great.
kidding.
She learns a lot. Now, I'm the part of the parents, in essence, that lets her get away with things, right? Watch an iPad here, stay up a little bit longer. So obviously my ex isn't all too happy when Allison comes back and says 11 o'clock at night, I'm not tired yet. So I'm the one who's to blame.
Well, you just have to coach Allison. That's because of the time change, honey. Just tell her it's because of the time change, you know?
I wish it was that case. Well, the in-laws live out in South Carolina, and we try to get her together with my niece-in-law, if we use the proper terms, and my nephew-in-law, etc. She always has a great time. I'm actually picking her up in August for school vacation. It's her birthday as well. Bring her down to South Carolina. But now is the age. She understands a lot, but cannot put the context necessarily together, right? So she recognizes, she knows what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, but she doesn't know yet how those things interact with each other. And that makes for some very interesting parenting situations. Hey, Daddy, why is that okay and that isn't? So anything to give her a well-rounded childhood and seeing more than just one perspective, I think, is what the key is to these kids. And it'll be challenging. She can be stubborn. That's not from me, that's from my ex, just for the record.
So, all right, you are a globetrotter. You're running a business, which we'll get to in a minute. You are a father. You're a fiance. How do you blow off steam? What do you do when you're off the clock?
It used to be tennis. A little bit harder to do in Phoenix, especially in the summertime, unless you want to get up at 4:30 in the morning. But everybody else wants to get up that early. Generally, it's hiking, quick weekend trips. And like you properly said, folks tend to have a misconception of Arizona. We were Memorial Day weekend up an area in northern Arizona called Mormon Lake. Although lake is a subjective term because sometimes what's called a lake now is a dry riverbed. It's just the nature of global warming and everything else. But we went up there, we went camping in the wild with about 6 other families and their kids and their dogs. And we have 2 dogs as well. They were running around without a leash the whole time. The gym here and there. And then quite frankly, sometimes just sitting there and watching a show or reading a good book or just sitting on a patio and not doing anything with a glass of wine in hand and either looking at the sunset or listening to the neighbors having a quinceañera. You find something, and sometimes nothing is the best.
Yeah. I no matter how busy work gets, or we just had our 4th kid, right? No matter how busy life gets, I refuse. We live on, it's a little over half an acre. And I refuse to hire out a lawn care service because I like to be out there, once or twice a week, where you mentioned like doing nothing, unplugging, right? I don't listen to music or podcast. It's just me for an hour, and the mind can just go, right? And it could be to a book, to your point about sitting and reading a book. It could be to a book I'm reading currently, to a book I read years ago, to an article, to something some problem we're trying to solve at work. And I think that we're so obsessed with productivity and efficiency culturally here in the States, at least, if not in the West at large, that I think we really do ourselves a disservice by eliminating the time for the brain to just rest. And that's oftentimes where those neurons start connecting, right? Because they're not overloaded. So, all right, well, Andreas, I could keep you here for a long time because there's a lot of things that I would like to go deeper on, but I want to know a little bit more about Downstream. What do you guys do? How do you stand out in a crowded marketplace? And what are the things that are top of mind for you these days?
Fair enough. And before I dive into that, one thing is really interesting what you just said, and it was spot on. Allowing those neurons to connect, taking time off, letting your brain rest. If you sit back and think about how many of your greatest ideas you've had when you were doing nothing versus trying to think of something to get to a point or come up with an invention or a different way. But if you don't do anything, if I hop into the shower, sometimes I have my greatest ideas in the shower. If I sit in the patio, a new idea comes up, something I can do differently. And our obsession with productivity and efficiency, it's actually counterproductive because we're spending so much time on actually being efficient that we at the end of the day become less efficient, which brings me to downstream. So, since 98 in the States and 99, I started out in the greater industry back in the good old paper days.
Good old is questionable, but go ahead.
Well, let's call them the old paper days. Paper to paper, right? With Icon many moons ago.
Oh, yeah.
Then it went paper to digital, digital to digital. Then digital forensics was thrown in. And I did this for about 21, 22 years. Always worked either for a service provider or worked for a law firm as like a lit support manager, building up litigation support departments from the ground up. Or here's a quick fun one before we finish with the past life. On a Friday afternoon, many years ago, I think in 2008, I got a call from the firm administrator from a mid-Atlantic medium-sized law firm. It was almost doing an attorney law firm. And he called me up and said he was referred to by my former VP and said, I was the guy. And I'm like, well, for what? He said, my entire team walked out this morning. So all of a sudden, within 5 minutes, the entire lit support team packed their stuff and left. So Sunday, I was on a flight down to Richmond, Virginia, and I spent the following 8 months in Richmond, Monday through Friday, and then flying back home to Boston every other weekend. Fortunately, my mom lives about 35 miles south of Richmond, but then rebuilding that from the ground up. But law firms, service providers, and downstream came up because I thought there is a better way when you go specializing on something. It's great if you're a jack of all trades, but if you think about your revenue, your profits, putting money into that, if you have to spread food among more mouths, so to speak, everyone just gets a couple bites. However, if you solely focus on something specific, which is what downstream is, you can be a lot more productive, efficient, cost-effective, and that's what we are. So Downstream is a digital forensics practice founded in September of 19. So we're almost 2.5 years old, 3.5 years old now, or 3 years old now almost. So there we go. It seems so long and so short at the same time. I tend to get confused.
Yeah.
But our focus was, or is still, solely digital forensics. And there with a particular love for mobile devices. Whether it's collection mobile device, processing those, filtering, analysis, those tend to get very tricky and involved. And by doing that, we allowed ourselves to become a voice and a resource in the marketplace where we work. 65% of our clients are service providers. And either we are their digital forensics department or the collection department, or we augment it, or we only take very complicated or high profile or celebrity cases on. And the other 35% roughly is law firms and corporations. But that's us, digital forensics practice, specializing on mobile devices. Obviously, we support everything under the sun as far as collection, analysis, and testimony goes. But mobile devices really has been our big mark.
So I commend you for that because, for a number of reasons. Number one, I mean, I've worked for big publicly traded companies, and my career has been increasingly going towards smaller and more entrepreneurial opportunities. And there is, I'm an MBA, right? A kind of a product marketing guy in this legal space, and there is this temptation, especially right for litigators, let's say, to be the jack of all trades, right? You have a UCC dispute, I can handle that. You have an IT dispute, or IP dispute, I can handle that. You have an internal investigation, I can handle that, right? Like I can do it all. And that's great if you have the transferable skill set, but from a marketing perspective, you gotta build a niche, right? Yeah. And your audience will self-select in, and then that flywheel of organic growth takes effect. And so, I think that there is, of course, a temptation among service providers, especially now with all this PE-driven M&A, to say we're end-to-end, we can do it all, one-stop shop. And yeah, that's true. But one of the things that our services group, in particular does is say hey, here's the capabilities we have in-house, right? And here are the things, if you come to us with this kind of a fact pattern, this situation, this is where we're going to engage one of these resources, right? Who is a testifying expert, or they have this credentials, or they have whatever the case may be. And I think you're starting to see the pendulum swing back to favor groups like Downstream, right? Who don't go to people and say, we can do it all, right? It's this is our lane. This is what we're really, really good at. And if you need something else, I've got a friend I want to introduce you to. So talk to me about how that message has either resonated in the marketplace or what challenges you faced in growth by choosing to stay narrow like that.
That's a good point. I think our biggest challenge, quite frankly, is sales and marketing, right? So you have the Bible, but how do you preach the word, so to speak, if you want to go down the religious routes? Obviously catering to different audiences, but then trying to convince them, if you don't have a prior relationship, trying to convince them that you can do things more effective, or that you have technology that separates you from everybody else, or is more fitting for a particular project or situation. Unless you have background with them or history, it's incredibly difficult. Now, the fun part here at Downstream was that we've never really done any sales. We've done a little bit of marketing here or there, a couple LinkedIn posts, a couple flyers, etc. But that's it. Everything else has been word of mouth. Referrals, existing relationships from prior engagements. But that's been our biggest holdup. How do we convince clients or potential clients that there is a different or better way? And one thing that folks generally hate me for is when I say very plainly, the collection portion of digital forensics is not rocket science. It's actually quite simple. About 90% of our cases are defensible collections, which means that we go and we gather data from various sources in a quote unquote defensible, repeatable manner. And we don't need to do a whole forensic image of a computer, right? We don't need to complicate things, but folks tend to make it a lot more complicated. So on the flip side, we break this down into very easy processes, hands-on, right? Transparency is one of our big pillars that we have here at Downstream. If you think about mobile device collections, generally custodians receive a big old carry-on size briefcase with a 9-pound laptop. The custodian powers it up. They have to connect to a Wi-Fi network, which means that the corporate IT guy already sits with the machete at the door saying, I don't know this computer. I don't want to bring China or Russia onto my network. Where we send them, a tiny laptop, which is a full forensic lab. We call it remote, so we came up with that. Size and thickness of your hand, got LTE on board, 3 terabytes worth of storage, runs Cellbrite, oxygen detective to collect your mobile devices. I can use it to collect your computer, files and folders from the server, but it's interactive with the custodian. So we go and we image the phone. Normally it goes back to the lab and we're saying, no, we can be transparent. We process it on site in front of the custodian. And if the case team is looking for messages between Ryan and Andreas for 2020, we filter that data out with the custodian. And that's especially important since COVID, companies with 1,000 employees didn't have 1,000 phones to give to their staff. Folks are working from home. So what happened was personal devices that personal data got intermingled with business data left, right, up, and down. And by having the ability to do this interactively with the custodian in front of their eyes, and then only walking away with a data set that they feel comfortable with, messages between Ryan and Andreas for 2020, it makes them happy. We like happy custodians. Happy custodians make happy clients. Clients are even more happy because they got exactly what they needed. And if 3 months down the road, they also need messages between Ryan and Andreas for 2021, we do a screen share with the custodian. And they unlock the original full image that we had created, that they password protected with their own password. And 5 minutes later, we have the second subset. Ultimately, our goal is to do targeted collections. Like I said, it's not rocket science what we do, but there's technology involved. Our main focus literally is repeatable, easy to understand processes, explaining to custodians. And my nickname is Mr. Analogy. So if there's Mr. Wonderful on Shark Tank, I might be Mr. Analogy in what we do. But explaining to folks that really know nothing about technology to here's what we actually do. And here's how you have total control over your data. And I don't want to see your financial records. I don't want to see family pictures, right? That's not what the tasting is like.
Yeah.
Like,
so, Mr. Analogy, I would love to put you on the spot and hand you a bunch of situations and say, explain this to me, but I better let you go before I get one or both of us in trouble. Andreas, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's very good to meet you.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Cheers.